Hello and good afternoon. My name is Haley Fehrenbach and I am an industrial and human factors engineer with Battelle Memorial Institute. I hold a Bachelor of Science in Design from the University of Cincinnati, as well as a Master of Science in Industrial and Human Factors Engineering from Wright State University. I have several years of experience in product design as well as in human factors engineering roles, focusing on multiple different device types, including combination drug devices, neurotechnology products, endomechanical and robotic surgery, and wound closure. So today I'll be presenting some research that Battelle is conducting in conjunction with the FDA around opportunities to leverage device functional assessment for classifying and evaluating user interface differences. Some of the topics I will be covering today will focus on an overview of current research and guidance around the ANDA submission process and supporting activities for generic combination drug devices. I'll then touch on some of the current challenges that have been identified and opportunities for further research. And then in the second half of the presentation, I'll focus on the current research that Battelle is working on in this space, including our planned methodology and some of the human factors activities we will be conducting. So as we know, generic device development is really key to reducing the cost of medical care and to increasing access to critical medications. In order to sustain this type of development, the FDA currently allows for ANDA submissions in lieu of following a more robust human factors testing path. So the goal of this ANDA submission is really to show that the proposed combination drug device is comparable to the reference listed drug without needing additional training or healthcare provider assistance. And in order to prove this, the current guidance suggests the use of a threshold analysis in order to assess and compare some of the attributes of the proposed design, as well as to identify any new use-related risks that might stem from the proposed design. So whether these are considered an improvement or simply just a difference, both of these do have the potential to introduce new risks based on the user's previous mental model. And so if substantial differences are found throughout this process, one of the commonly proposed methods is to utilize a comparative use human factors study to validate those differences. So in looking at the current process and draft guidance surrounding ANDA submissions for generic combination drug devices, we've identified some challenges that might require further development and research. The challenges that we've identified fall into two different categories, and the first that we'll look at is assessing design differences. So the first challenge that we've come across in this space is the guidance around conducting a threshold analysis in order to assess those design differences. This is the recommended approach, but in-depth guidance is not necessarily provided to help guide this involvement. The second that we've come across is during the process of identifying design differences in that threshold analysis, these differences must be categorized as either no difference, a minor difference, or other, but categorizing these might create some challenges. So while general characteristics of each of these categories are outlined, it might be difficult to place a difference depending on the specific product due to the lack of clarity around these categories. And the third challenge that we've come across is the classification of other differences when there's a substantial difference that's found. The current guidance states that a difference falls into the other category if differences in the UI might impact a critical design attribute, which involves the administration of the product. It is unclear, however, what is specifically meant by administration of the product. And finally, labeling exceptions are also allowed due to the assumed differences that will be necessary in the task analysis for generic devices compared to the RLD. But while these exceptions are noted to be allowed, it's unclear to what extent the labeling is allowed to be different. The second category of challenges that we've identified is around comparative use human factors studies. So if there are design differences that are categorized as other that are found during the threshold analysis, additional human factors activities might be required in order to validate the differences here. One of the common methods for validating these is through the use of a comparative use human factors study. So while these studies are one of the most commonly used and the recommended path in the current draft guidance, the studies do tend to be time-consuming and costly due to the high sample size requirements. So alternatives to these studies are allowed, however, they're not clearly outlined currently as to what is acceptable or what has the potential to be used. So when looking at the current draft guidance and the challenges that were previously outlined, we've identified several opportunities for further research. The first opportunity is for design difference categories and the labeling exception guidance to both be further defined and clarified. The second opportunity that we've identified is to better define which steps of the task analysis require analysis for those design differences. The third opportunity is to find other alternatives that might prove to be more efficient than a comparative use human factors study. And the fourth opportunity is for the incorporation of use risk methodologies, which might mean developing and evaluating a UFMEA between all of the devices that we're comparing, which might help to provide additional data. And finally, while it's not required in the scope of this research, we've also identified a further opportunity to assess the internal mechanics of a device, just to see how these might vary between the RLD and the proposed generic device, and how these might affect the user interface differences that are found. In order to conduct research on these challenges and opportunities, we're proposing a multi-step approach using existing human-centered design methodologies. The process will start with a literature search in order to understand the current literature and any gaps in the research in this space. Then we'll move into the selection of devices for comparison. We'll evaluate the devices that we've selected, then move into the categorization of design differences and the development of new methods for categorization. We'll then move into the development of new methods for assessing those other design differences. And finally, we'll incorporate these methods into other areas that may benefit from these. So to begin the research process, we did conduct a literature search using terms such as drug delivery, switching, use areas, and human factors research. There were two main goals of doing this literature search. The first was to identify any areas where research has already been conducted in regard to assessing differences between devices. The second goal was to identify where research has not yet been conducted and where those gaps might exist. Our next step in this research process is to select products for comparison and to conduct an evaluation. So during this phase, we selected several different devices in order to conduct a threshold analysis for further guidance development and also to conduct the initial review. We did select injection pen devices for the scope of this research, and we identified these in conjunction with the FDA based on several different factors, such as their applicability and anticipated prevalence in future markets, as well as the limited published data that's currently available for these devices. We did select several different injection pens that were identified to be utilized as generic proposed devices, and then selected one device in particular for use as the RLD comparator. We selected these devices also based on their similarities and their differences in order to provide the most robust data for this research. We identified two different types of injection pens to be used in this research. One is a manual injection pen, and the second is a semi-automated injection pen. We chose two different types of injection pens in order to create a more robust assessment and to identify challenges related to substitutability between both of these types of devices. So both the manual and the semi-automated injection pens have a similar pen-like form factor. The manual pen requires the user to conduct all of the steps for use from preparation all the way through to injection. And this also includes the use of force to manually depress the injection button to deliver the drug. The semi-automated injection pen likewise requires the user to conduct preparation steps, but it does vary during the injection step in which the user has to depress the injection button in order to actuate the automated dose delivery. The next step in this process is to evaluate and compare the devices that we've selected. So several aspects are evaluated during the threshold analysis process for each of these devices. We'll start by looking at labeling and look at the IFU, the packaging, and device labeling, and compare between devices to see if we can find any differences. We'll then do a task analysis breakdown and a use risk assessment for each device. We'll develop and compare each of those for each device, to identify any differences. Then we'll move into a physical device assessment, looking at aspects such as force requirements, haptic feedback, and device materials. And then finally, although it's not required for the scope of this project, we've identified the opportunity to do a mechanical teardown as well. So we'll use this to assess the inner mechanics of the devices to understand if and how the inner mechanical differences might play a role in the UI differences that are identified. We think that exploring this aspect might have the possibility to enhance some of the future guidance as well. So once all of the devices have been evaluated and the differences have been identified, we'll categorize each of these differences into no difference, minor, or other categories. We'll also continue to explore available literature in order to identify potential opportunities for classifying these devices. Our objective with this step is really going to be to help clarify the guidance around classifying design differences and also to propose any new methods for doing so. So typically, design characteristics that are identified as being substantially different will need to be categorized as other after that threshold analysis. And if a design characteristic does fall into this category, typically a comparative use human factors study will need to be used in order to validate those differences. And as I previously mentioned, comparative use human factors studies do have a tendency to be pretty lengthy and costly just due to the sample size that's required for these type of studies. So our goal at this step is really going to be to identify any of those possible alternatives that might be more efficient than the use of those comparative use human factors studies, and that also provide that same level of validation. So for any differences that we identify in our work during this process, we'll also work to identify what those alternative methods might look like and any potential risk that's presented between the RLD and our generic devices that we're assessing. The final stage of our process is to leverage our findings and recommendations that we've found over the course of the research in order to expand the applicability to other areas that might be relevant. So we'll look at gaps that we've identified throughout this process to determine where we might be able to slot in this new research and the guidance. The goal of this is really going to be to provide the guidance that might be applicable to other entities that might also need a more efficient method of assessing those design differences. So just to wrap up here, we've identified several challenges and opportunities for research around ANDA submission for generic combination devices. We're proposing a multidisciplinary approach to conduct this research in the hope that we can provide enhanced methods for categorization of these design differences. We're also hoping to identify alternative methods for assessing those other design differences as opposed to the traditional method of using a comparative use human factors study. So a few of the outcomes that we're hoping to achieve through this include the streamlined guidance for more efficient ANDA submissions, decreased time for generic combination drug devices to reach the market, and finally, for greater public access to generic combination drug devices. And that concludes my presentation for today. I'd like to thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to further discussion here in a few moments.